The letter was bright red, not the color of danger, but of arrogance. Violation notice, unauthorized watercraft storage. It read in bold, all-caps font. The kind of tone that screamed we're in charge before you even reached the signature. I stood on my porch, boat key still dangling from my hand, and read it again, making sure I hadn't hallucinated the absurdity. The HOA was fining me for keeping my boat tied up at the dock behind my house. I laughed at first. Not the funny kind of laugh, but the low, bubbling sound that starts when disbelief meets outrage. How could they possibly fine me for something on my own property? The letter even specified, all watercraft must be registered and approved by the HOA board. Failure to comply will result in daily fines until removal. The fine started at $200 a day. $200 a day for a boat I'd been docking there for years. But here's the thing, that dock wasn't just mine. The entire lake it rested on was mine too. Yes, you read that right. I, Evan Pierce, own Crystal Lake. It wasn't always mine, of course. 10 years ago, when my wife and I were still new to the community, Crystal Lake was just a pretty body of water surrounded by houses that all looked a little too similar. A homeowners association had popped up later, filled with retirees who loved rules and power more than peace and quiet. They started with reasonable things, trash bins hidden by fences, lawns trimmed to regulation height, no unsightly decorations, which apparently included my daughter's pink flamingo. I kept my head down, paid the dues, and lived quietly. Then my wife died. Cancer, quick and cruel. The house that once felt alive with laughter turned into a mausoleum. The only thing that brought me any comfort was taking the old boat out at dawn, letting the mist roll over the water as I drifted in silence. That lake, our lake, became my sanctuary. So, when the HOA decided to beautify the community by dredging part of it and fencing the access points, I looked into the lake's legal ownership. Turns out, the previous developer never transferred the title of the water rights when the neighborhood was built. It had been sold separately in an old auction years earlier. And guess who bought it back then as part of an investment bundle for almost nothing? Me. I didn't even realize it until I went digging through my real estate files. Crystal Lake wasn't just a shared amenity. It was private property, my private property. So, when I got that letter, I knew this wasn't just a fine. It was a declaration of war. The HOA president, a woman named Linda Carmichael, lived 3 houses down from me. She was the kind of person who smiled while cutting your throat, perfectly coiffed hair, designer suits, and the personality of a rattlesnake wearing lipstick. She loved to quote the bylaws like they were scripture. I decided to pay her a visit. "Linda," I said the next morning, knocking on her pristine white door. "Got a minute to talk about this?" I waved the notice like a red flag. She opened the door with that practiced suburban smile that never reached her eyes. "Ah, Evan, I was hoping you'd stop by. You see, we can't have unregistered boats cluttering up the shoreline. It sets a bad precedent." "Cluttering up the shoreline?" I asked. "Linda, it's the only boat out there." "Yes, but rules are rules." She said it sweetly, like she was handing me poison in a cup of tea. I looked over her shoulder at the framed HOA chart on her wall, all official and self-righteous. Out of curiosity, "Linda," I said, "what gives the HOA authority over the lake?" She blinked. "The lake is a community asset. It falls under the jurisdiction of the Homeowners Association." I grinned. "You sure about that?" "Of course," she said, voice sharp with condescension. "The board voted on it last year." "Well," I said, leaning in, "your board might want to check its paperwork. Because that lake, every drop of it, belongs to me." Her smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" I handed her a copy of the deed. "See this? Property number 104B, Crystal Lake and surrounding water rights. Purchased by me, signed, sealed, and filed with the county recorder's office. 10 years ago." She stared at the document, her lips parting slightly. "That's not possible." "Oh, it's very possible," I said. "Which means your board can't fine me for having a boat on my lake. In fact, your board members might want to stop fishing there, too. Technically, that's trespassing." Her expression hardened. You can't seriously be. Oh, I'm serious, I said. You fine me for my boat again, and I'll start enforcing no trespassing laws. That means no HOA barbecues, no community fishing events, no paddle boards. Nothing. Consider this a courtesy warning. And with that, I left her standing in her doorway, clutching the deed like it was a grenade. That should have been the end of it. But Linda wasn't the type to admit defeat. The next week, I got another letter. This time, it wasn't about the boat, it was about my unkempt shoreline. Apparently, I was violating community standards by allowing weeds and reeds to grow beyond the acceptable limit. They fined me again. I could almost admire the audacity. Almost. Instead, I decided to show them what real enforcement looked like. I called the county clerk and filed a notice of restriction, effectively marking Crystal Lake as private property. Then I put up signs. Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. The HOA went berserk. At first, they tried to ignore it, but then I caught 3 of them fishing from the far dock one afternoon. When I told them they were trespassing, they laughed. So I called the sheriff's department. They didn't laugh after that. Watching the HOA vice president explain to the deputy that we're the homeowners association, while being politely escorted off my property was a sight I'll never forget. Still, the war was just beginning. A few days later, I started receiving emails from neighbors, some angry, some confused. The HOA had sent out a community-wide memo claiming I was withholding access to community property and endangering the neighborhood's shared values. I replied to everyone with a scanned copy of the deed and one sentence. You might want to ask your board why they didn't know who owns the lake. That's when everything exploded. Suddenly, people were turning on Linda. Homeowners started showing up at meetings demanding answers. Someone even leaked audio from an HOA session where Linda called me a bitter old man with a boat and a vendetta. She wasn't entirely wrong. But then, she crossed the line again. A week later, I woke up to find my dock damaged. Someone had cut through the ropes, leaving my boat drifting into the reeds. No note, no apology, just the silent arrogance of people who thought they could still control me. I knew it was her. I knew it was the HOA. And that's when I decided it was time for revenge. They thought I'd just sit quietly, maybe hire a lawyer or complain. But they had no idea what kind of power came with owning that lake. I spent the next few weeks digging through the community's water use permits, recreational access guidelines, and even their landscaping irrigation agreements. Every single one of them relied on my water source. Sprinkler systems, pulled from the lake, community park fountain, lake-fed, fishing tournaments, hosted on my property. It was all connected. By the time I finished my research, I realized I held the entire HOA by the throat. They just didn't know it yet. So, I asked myself a question as I stood at the water's edge that evening, watching the sunset burn gold across the ripples. How far would they push me before they realized they were standing on land, and water that wasn't theirs? The answer, I decided, was about to be too far, because I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to make them beg for access to the very lake they tried to control. They say power reveals itself in small, steady ways, the drip of a faucet, the slow loosen of a knot. Mine revealed itself in paperwork, signatures, and a single carefully timed phone call. After I put the no trespassing signs up and watched the sheriff escort HOA members off my dock, I didn't celebrate or gloat. Vindication is loud. Strategy is quiet. I spent the next week mapping everything that ran on Crystal Lake. Irrigation lines that fed lawns, valves that hummed under community parks, the piping that kept the little fountain by the clubhouse from becoming a forlorn, dusty bowl. What surprised me wasn't that the HOA relied on the lake. It was how badly they had depended on convenience. They'd let contractors run clandestine lines. They paid for temporary hookups that had never been properly permitted. They convinced themselves the lake was communal because it had been easier to treat it that way. I had the deeds, the county filings, and, crucially, the right to control water access. So I drafted a notice. It was short, sterile, and utterly devastating in its clarity. Notice of restricted access. Effective immediately, Crystal Lake water rights are private property of Evan Pierce. Recreational, commercial, and maintenance use of lake water must be authorized with written permission. Unauthorized access constitutes trespass. I posted it at every access point and on the HOA's community board, the very board Linda used to pin up photos of bake sales and beach cleanup flyers. Then I sent certified letters to the HOA board and to every single household in the neighborhood. The letters explained, in civil but unambiguous language, that they were welcome to apply for access. They would be considered. Permits would have fees. Approval would come with conditions. The first response was disbelief. The second was outrage. The third was a beautifully coordinated campaign of denial led by Linda, who hired a small law firm half a state away that specialized in community representation. They called me everything from eccentric to extortionist. Linda posted a petition and garnered signatures faster than I expected. People sent angry messages. One neighbor, the woman from 2 houses down who sold cupcakes at the school fundraiser, wrote me a passive-aggressive email about how I was destroying the sense of community. Fine. Let them be furious. Let them feel the pinch of consequence. I had no desire to drown anyone or cut families off from water in a cruel way. I wanted leverage, not ruin. So I set terms that would be inconvenient, humiliating, and instructive, but not destructive. First, permits. Any household that relied on the lake for irrigation or recreation had to apply. The application process required proof of water meter installation at their property line, a signed affidavit that any private lines were up to code, and reimbursement for past unauthorized use. The fee schedule was intentionally steep enough to be painful but not ruinous, enough to make Linda's We're Family rhetoric sound very small when people cleared their bank accounts. Second, training. Anyone granted access had to attend a mandatory water safety and stewardship session hosted by me. I called it a community responsibility workshop. It was 12 hours long, and it took place on Saturdays at dawn, because I like mornings and revenge tastes sweeter with coffee and sunrise. People complained, but they came. Third, privileges. The HOA could apply for a collective permit, but it would require the board to publicly repudiate the old misrepresentations about the lake and to reinstate community oversight measures that included transparency clauses and an independent auditor. In short, they could keep fishing and hosting barbecues, but only if the people who led the board stopped being faceless arbiters of taste and instead accepted oversight. The first week, the neighborhood turned into a furious, fevered thing. There were town hall-style meetings at the clubhouse, impassioned speeches, tears, and, of course, Linda's inevitable declaration that she was a public servant standing up for homeowners. People who had never missed meetings started showing up. People who had always assumed someone else paid attention finally asked uncomfortable questions. How long had we been drawing water without permits? Who signed off on the landscaping contracts? Where did the funds go? That last question cut deepest of all. Someone on the board, a quiet accountant with a hobby for spreadsheets, leaked a budget spreadsheet to the neighborhood forum. It showed a vague category labeled recreational maintenance that had ballooned over the years, money funneled to a contractor who coincidentally also fertilized Linda's lawn. There were invoices that simply said materials, and checks made out to companies no one could find at their listed addresses. Suddenly it wasn't just about a boat. It was about competence. It was about trust. People started asking for receipts and contractors' licenses. The community, long anesthetized by the ease of delegation, woke up. Meanwhile, I enforced the no trespassing signs with the patience of someone watching a cliffside erosion. I let small things be, a late-night jogger, a child with a fishing pole, until I caught 3 board members sneaking onto my shore for a twilight fishing trip. I called the sheriff. The deputy came, gentle but firm. It was awkward and humiliating. For the first time, Linda had to explain her actions in front of her neighbors, and the words, "We are the homeowners association," sounded thin and brittle. Legal action followed. Of course it did. The HOA's lawyer sent me a barrage of cease and desist letters and innuendo. I replied with copies of the deed, the county records, and a notarized affidavit documenting their unauthorized hookups. When they tried to file for an injunction claiming emergency communal water needs, I pointed to their own record showing multiple days when they had diverted water for lawn watering and events. Their emergency claim evaporated like mist. But the lawsuits were dull theater compared to what really shifted things. Truth. Once I made the lake's private status public and required accountability for its use, a cascade of revelations followed. Homeowners discovered their sprinkler systems were siphoning from a private source, and that meant one thing: they owed for water they had used. Some were furious, others were embarrassed. A few quietly paid their back fees and installed meters. A couple of families left, selling their houses to buyers who were more careful about bylaws and deeds. Through all this, I kept my boat polished and my dock in good repair. I helped neighbors who sincerely wanted to comply, showing them where to get proper permits, walking with them through meter installation, even letting a young single father borrow the boat for an afternoon with his daughter after he'd filled out his application. I wanted to be fair, not petty. There's a difference between revenge and cruelty. Linda, however, was not placated by fairness. Her world had been order. She made rules, people obeyed, and her authority was a currency she spent liberally. To her, accountability looked like humiliation. She doubled down. She organized a blockade of the community entrance with placards and righteous slogans. She rallied the most vocal dissenters into a conspiracy of grievance, a Save Our Lake campaign that tried to paint me as a villain in borrowed grammar. That was her mistake. I had not only uncovered their mismanagement, I had also given people the language to talk about it. The accountant who leaked the spreadsheet hosted an independent audit that revealed mismatched invoices and unauthorized expenditures. The community forum filled up with posts of neighbors thanking me for transparency. No protest could erase the files, the permits, or the truth printed on county letterhead. One Saturday morning, during a town meeting that felt more like a reckoning than a ritual, Linda's own treasurer, a woman who baked her cookie for years and had admired Linda's leadership, stood up and read a list of findings, unauthorized expenditures, conflict of interest, and a recommendation for immediate resignation by the current board. The clubhouse hummed with the sound of mouths opening and closing around the new narrative. Linda looked at me. There was something like fear in her eyes now. It wasn't fear of law or loss. It was fear of insignificance. She had been dethroned not by force, but by people who finally chose to pay attention. The board resigned within days. A new, transparent committee was elected, complete with oversight and external audits. They negotiated an HOA-wide permit that allowed measured access to Crystal Lake on the condition that the HOA publicly acknowledged the lake's private status, reimbursed me for past unauthorized use, and funded an endowment for lake conservation, a clause I insisted on because I liked the lake and didn't want it abused. As for Linda, she moved to a town a few counties away, where she could start anew as a preening queen of a smaller court. She mailed me a brief note, tersely apologetic, and wrapped in the kind of self-congratulatory language that insisted she was the aggrieved party. I kept the note in a drawer. It was a perfect souvenir. On the day the new permit went into effect, the neighborhood held a small, awkward barbecue by the clubhouse. People came with paper plates and awkward smiles. They thanked me, some sincerely, some with the sheepish politeness of those who are being corrected. Children chased each other on the grass. The fountain ran, the sprinklers clicked on schedules that had meters to justify them, and the lake, my lake, shimmered as if nothing had happened at all. I stood on my dock that evening, the sun sinking in a slow, forgiving arc. I watched a teenager pull a fish from the water and sprint to her father, triumphant. I listened to the laughter of neighbors who had argued fiercely with me months earlier, now trading recipes and fishing tips. The revenge, when it arrived, had not been about pain. It had been about restoring balance, accountability for those who assumed rights they never owned, and a sober reminder that property, like power, is only as secure as the truth that backs it. There was still a part of me that wanted to rub Linda's nose in it a little more. But the boat rode steady in the ripples, and the lake, my sanctuary, had been defended. I poured myself a cup of coffee, watched the mist gather like a lace veil over the water, and realized that in the end, the most satisfying victory was not in punishment, but in making the neighborhood reckon with itself. They had fined me for my boat, thinking I was a nuisance to be tamed. They had underestimated the thing that kept me anchored. Grief turned into stewardship, anger turned into action. In reclaiming the lake, I reclaimed more than shorelines and docks. I reclaimed a sliver of peace. And if anyone wanted to fish on my water now, they knew the price: respect, paperwork, and the humility to read the deed before they cast a line.